Paul Perello, and welcome to the Philly Factor. You know, in our world of instant gratification, where practically everything today that we need or perhaps we don't need is just a click away on the internet, can you imagine spending time on a project that lasted 25 years? I know it's unheard of in this day and age. Or how about where relationships come and go faster than some people take out the trash? Well, committing yourself to a project so intense that some might question, why would you want to get involved in such a project in the first place? Well, my guest on our program today has spent the last 25 years painstakingly translating a biography. And it's not just any ordinary biography. It's the 300-year-old biography of the 17th century French biography of St. Augustine of Hippo. Professor Frederick Van Fulleren is a professor of philosophy at Lasalle University. He's been immersed in this process of translating the 1,300-page French biography of Augustine into English. And Professor, I want to welcome you to the program.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
And congratulations on your accomplishment.
Well, thank you.
I think you would agree in this day and age where anything is just a mouse click away on the internet, you were really immersed in this project for 25 years.
Well, I must say, I think that in anything in life, is commitment and perseverance is the key to the thing, right? And it's not a question of so much of intelligence or anything. It's a question of staying with the project, right? And I did that through thick and thin, really, for 25 years. So I must say I'm kind of proud of that, right?
Absolutely.
I started it with 3 other people. 2 have died, and 1 had to drop out for personal reasons. But so the project became mine, right? And in a certain sense, even though I knew something about Augustine when we started, somehow Augustine became mine, you know? So.
Sure. Well, before we get into your work and how you got involved in the project, you mentioned the name Augustine, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with St. Augustine, but who was Augustine?
Well, Augustine lived in the 4th and 5th century. He was born in an outpost in the Algerian desert. In his own time, it was called Tagaste or Tagaste. Today it's called Soukara. And it's like an oasis in the middle of the desert. His father owned some orchards in the middle of the desert. And then, well, he became the most important figure in the history of Christianity, really, being all Christian philosophy and Christian theology depends upon him. But he was in this, so to speak, African outback, right? That's where he was born. And his mother was a local tribeswoman, and they knew they had a genius on their hands. That's the thing you can say about his parents. And I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I've seen it where the kid's a genius and the parents are not geniuses.
Right.
And they don't know how, they're confused by the kid. And I'm sure that's what happened with them, but they knew they had to give him some education. And so his father got together some money. His father was not wealthy by the locals, by any standard, but he gave the kid off 16th year, and he sent him off to what we would call university, although there was no university at the time, but university level education in Carthage. And that was the start of the whole thing for him.
And Augustine was by no stretch of the imagination the perfect son. I mean, he is a saint of the Catholic Church, and you would say, well, he had to be the perfect son. Far from being perfect in his earlier years.
Well, this is what's usually known about Augustine, besides anything else. He wrote a work called The Confessions. And it purports in some sense to be an autobiography. It's not really an autobiography. He calls episodes from his life to illustrate a thesis. And the thesis he had just really come upon in the writings of St. Paul about a year earlier. And the notion was that everything depends upon the grace of God. And so what he did in this work is paint himself as a sinner. And the theme of the work, among many others, right, is the miseria or unhappiness of man, the misery of man, and the misericordia, the mercy of God. And he tries to show in that work this thesis. But one of the things that comes through is he paints himself as a sinner. If you read the thing, you can see that's, well, you know, I mean, we're all sinners, right? But for example, he takes, in the 16th year, when his father gave him the year off, he tells you about time one night he went out and pulled full of childhood prank. He went out and stole some pears, and then he and his buddies threw them to the pigs, right? And the parents wouldn't believe that they had done that, right? The kids had done that. Why does he take this thing out? Well, he's illustrating the notion. Why did he do it? He did it for what we would say the hell of it, right?
Right.
A prank. And he tried to show the gratuitousness of that evil. He was not what you'd call scrupulous, but he was trying to illustrate a point: the grace of God and the misery of man, right? And so what they know about Augustine is that he was a sinner, because he paints himself that way, and he was. But painted against the times.
Right.
You know, I mean, he lived an ordinary life of the secular, right? If you, for instance, Rome was a class society, so you couldn't marry somebody outside your class. Well, what happened if you're gonna get together with somebody? You can't marry them, well, you go to live together, and that's what he did. He went to live together. It was what we would call probably a common law marriage, right? And he was held a certain. He was a Manichaean, so a certain. He was averse to having children, but he had a mistake. His son was Adeodatus, and he loved him. Yeah, and so he had what we would call a child by a common law wife.
Right. Which was not accepted by any stretch of the imagination at that time.
Well, it was an accepted thing, but when he was a bright man, he was on the way up. He was going to, and his mother comes and he says, you can't live with this woman and become, say a governor of one of the provinces in Rome, which was in the Roman Empire, which was probably what was going to happen to him.
Right.
And so his mother says, you have to get rid of this lady. And he did. Right? Not every son would do that, right?
Right.
But the reason that they were together was because they were not of the same class, and he could not advance in a career if he had this lady at his side.
So I want to talk then about this work that you begin 25 years ago and have just completed the third volume of this translation. And I don't want to minimize the word translation, because today people could think, well, why couldn't you just take the original text and just type it into a computer, and with a computer program you would get an interpretation? But you can't do that in this work.
No, you can't. First of all, this is the most important or the most comprehensive biography of Augustine. It was done by a small man, Louis Sebastian Lenain de Thiémont, the dwarf of Thiémont. He was a small man, but that's the family name. And they had primogeniture at the time, so the son, the first son, inherited the title and inherited the estate. He went to live then on his brother's estate, which was his father's estate, and in northern France, right? Now, he wrote a 16-volume work on the history of the church from the beginnings till 513, and then he died, and so the work remained there. And the 13th volume is on Augustine. And it's been known, I say, since that time as the best biography ever written. Nevertheless, you can't just feed it, as you say, into a computer. There's various reasons for this, but 17th century French has long involved sentences. In English, we speak in the short declarative sentence.
Right.
So you had to translate with that in mind, right? Then also, his views of Augustine. I mean, Augustine was a saint. There's no question about that. But he emphasizes that on practically every page, and I had to kind of play that down a bit so it would be acceptable to modern ears, you know. And then just some of the vocabulary is completely different, right? Not only from 20th century, 21st century English, but also from 21st century French.
Right, yeah.
So you take some interpretation, some words you couldn't find and this sort of thing, at least I couldn't find them anyhow. Realize I want to say here, I studied French, but I was no scholar in French, right? So I had to learn by doing, you know.
So what made you decide that this was the project that you and your three other collaborators wanted to get involved in?
The fellow that I was writing with, we had started a series called Collectanea Augustiniana, so a collection on St. Augustine, and he wanted to do this project, and he wanted somebody. He knew he'd need somebody that knew something about St. Augustine, So he asked me if I'd join in, and I was happy to join in because it was my life work, right? So that's how it started. And then he was good at, or wanted to get people together to collaborate. And so he asked a third person who was an Augustinian, but he was old, and he recently died at age 100 in the Villanova Monastery. And then he asked a friend of his, or I asked his friend really, to join in. And so we had a group of 4. But I realized even at the beginning that I was the Augustine man, and this thing was going to center on me. And then when the other 2 people died and the other fellow dropped out, I was going to be the only one, right? Mm-hmm. But I was convinced that it was an important project, and so I continued on, right?
So let me ask you then, now that you have completed this work, what happens to this biography now that you have translated?
Well, it may be that it's only honored after my death, right? This may well be true. But what happens is it's being published by Peter Long Publishing, and they sell things to libraries, so it will be in a lot of libraries, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And then a lot of scholars in Augustine, they're all over the world, right? I think they'll want a copy of this, right? And then who knows who else will want it. So, but it is scholarly work in a sense. I mean, it's not something that you pick up and read to your kid or something, right? But I'm hopeful anyhow that it will be reach a certain scholarly and reach a certain ecclesiastical audience.
So as you begin this process of this translation, give me an idea and give the audience an idea how you were able to work on this project and live a semi-normal lifestyle. I mean, because you're also teaching at the same time, too.
Let me tell you, the first thing that happened is we had to locate a text of this. They had a Latin text of it, which appeared with all the works of Augustine, but we wanted to get the original French. And we looked all over this country, and we couldn't find the 13th volume of the history that he did. So I was going to Vienna every summer, and I visited a friend in a place called Lasalle, which is just across the border in Germany, but just across from Salzburg. And he went to the University of Salzburg, and they had a copy of this. Mm-hmm. So we photocopied it, and it was in a 1732 Venice edition. Mm-hmm. So that was the first thing, finding a copy of the thing, right?
Now, when you say you photocopied, are you putting like the quarter in the machine and putting?
No, I'm not doing this. No. The librarian did that for us.
That's 1,300 pages, right?
Well, it was a lot of pages. Yeah, and then there's notes in the margin that he made, right, on every page, and you had to figure out what the notes meant. All right. So, which eventually you find out,
sure.
Right? So, but then what happens is you learn by doing, right? So I learned a lot about 17th century French. I don't know if I could teach it, but I learned a lot about the way they expressed themselves, and it's the way he expressed himself as an author. And you become convinced that this is a work of some importance in the history of theology, in the history of philosophy, in the history of the church. And so that kind of gives you the impetus to do the thing.
Right. So now you have all these photostated pages.
Yeah.
You come back to the United States and you start
Well, we had it on a microfilm.
Okay, all right.
And we took it to people in Villanova, and don't tell me how they do this, but they reproduce in pages.
Okay, all right.
And we had pages of 1,200 pages, right? And they were big, long leaves like this, right? And then we each had a copy. But then I was the one that was going to be the main cog in the wheel. We knew this. So, and then you just started working, and all I can say is one thing leads to another,
sure.
You know.
You went through paper, you went through pens. You also wore out 3 laptops on this project?
Well, I did. I keep bringing laptops over to Europe in the summer, and I didn't know much about computers, you know. But computers advance, and computers wear out. And I didn't understand this when I started, right? But so you go, yes, I've gone through, as a matter of fact, I have a 3rd laptop now, and I'm thinking about getting a 4th laptop. But that's the nature of computers, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But you learn, and I learned a lot about computers, but only on a need-to-know basis. So there's wide gaps in my knowledge about computers, right? But I tried to learn what I need to know, even unto the present day, right? As we're talking today, I was talking to people in New York about how to produce this third volume, right?
Right.
And I'm learning about things how I can do things on the computer. And I've asked other people here and some people in the department, and I learn as I learn all the time that I'm the fellow that has to learn how to do it. And this summer, for example, I spent indexing the third volume. And I tried and tried and tried before the summer to get somebody else to do it. And I came to the realization I'm the only fellow probably in the world that could do it.
Sure.
So I had to sit my behind in the chair, right, and do it.
Right.
And so.
And learning never stops. Proof positive that learning never stops.
Oh, it's certainly, in my case, you learn more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing, right?
Yeah. So, as you walk away from this experience then, or you come away from this experience then, was there anything that you learned about Augustine that you didn't know? I'm sure there are many things that you learned.
I learned an immense amount. When I started this work in 1968, that is the work in Augustine. Well, actually, I started about 1965, right? But in 1968 to 1971, I really concentrated on the Confessions and reading the seventh book of the Confessions. And the reason I did that, as I look back, is that everybody else is doing the same things, eh? So, I had got a particular theory in the seventh book of the Confessions and what he reports there, how it influences his early work. But Augustine wrote 93 works, 232 books. We're continually finding new sermons and new letters. We estimate maybe we have 10% of the sermons that he preached. And he was never left not to preach. Whenever he was visiting someplace and he was at Mass, it was Augustine they asked to preach, right? Nobody else would preach besides him. So we're continually finding new sermons and new letters, right? But 93 works, 232 books, it takes a lifetime.
Sure.
It takes a lifetime and although there's many, his themes remain constant and he elaborates them more and more, nevertheless, it takes a lifetime to study him, really. And that's the difficulty in studying Augustine, is you have to devote your lifetime to it. And he's an author that wrote 1,600 years ago.
Right, right.
So they say, well, why are you doing that? Well, you have to be convinced that he made a contribution, which in fact he did, and that you can decipher, so forth, what that contribution is.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to discuss his contributions, I mean, many people say he was a great scholar, he was a learned man, a great theologian. I mean, and not to pick one, but I mean, what was his? When you look at all of his works and read all of his works, or you read his sermons, I mean, is Augustine as important today as he was in his day?
He's the beginning of the whole thing in the West, the beginning of what we would call the theological project or the Christian philosophical project in the West. Let me say something to you about the question. He was a genius, no doubt, a universal genius. He wasn't a scholar as what we would understand a scholar. St. Jerome was a scholar. St. Jerome lived in a cave in Bethlehem and translated all these languages, right? Augustine knew some Greek, and that was about the only other language he knew besides Latin, right? But he was a genius.
Right.
And so you can say, well, why is he important for today? Well, he's important for today because he's the beginning of what we call Christian philosophy and Catholic theology. Not only Catholic theology, but all Christian theology, practically. Practically every thinker, whether orthodox or heterodox, tries to go back to Augustine. Now, and somebody wrote a book that said the 17th century was the age of Augustine. Well, of course, every age is the age of Augustine. Sure. It's just of a different Augustine. He wrote all these works. So in the 20th century, it's the Augustine of the Confessions that we talked about. In the 17th century is the works of Augustine on grace and free will. In the Middle Ages, it's Augustine and the City of God. It's Augustine and the Trinity. So every age, I say, is an age of Augustine. He influenced every age in the church. He influenced every age in the church substantially. In other words, there's a work that's just come out. It's about 800 pages. It's 3 volumes. It's called the Reception of Augustine. And it tries to go into every century, into the major authors, and show major theological, philosophical authors, and see what the influence of Augustine is on them. That was a tremendous work. He brought everybody to get all these Augustine scholars and scholars from other fields too together to do something like that. And it shows that even in our day, or also in our day, or particularly in our day, we realize how influential and how essential the works of Augustine are.
In the few minutes that we have left here, obviously in reading about you in a recent article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and even hear you talk here on the program, you're very passionate about your subject matter. You were at one time an Augustinian.
I was. I went to an Augustinian high school in Detroit. Doesn't exist anymore, Austin Catholic Prep. And I liked it so much, I joined the order. And we went out to Chicago. And then I got a chance to study under this fellow in Dublin, to study Augustine. Came back, was a year in Chicago, and then I was 6 years at Villanova. And then one thing led to another, and I left the order.
So did that influence your desire to dive headfirst into
well,
this?
It certainly did influence, and I got a chance to do it, because there were, the order would be interested in somebody going on and doing that. So yes, I got a chance to do it, but I went far beyond what the order would have expected, or what even the University of Villanova would have expected, right?
Is Augustine, how is he looked at? Here in the United States, where perhaps we don't revere as much the theologians of the church in a secular world that we live in. Is he seen or viewed differently in other parts of the world?
Well, first of all, this is getting my own take on this now, right? I think the history of French theology is a history of the commentaries on St. Augustine. That's the first thing to understand. In the Western world, he's held in great respect. In the Eastern world too, but not as much. By that I mean Eastern Christianity, right? The study of St. Augustine was for a long time confessional. I just tried to mention that in every age they went back to Augustine. Right. So Martin Luther went back to Augustine, and Calvin went back to Augustine. It's not only what we would call Orthodox Catholicism. Everybody went back to Augustine, right? And in the correct interpretations, incorrect interpretations. And so, its importance really lies there, I think, right? And all these people that are scattered all over the world, Augustine is revered, even though not a whole lot is known about him. Now, let me say one more thing. In the studies of St. Augustine contemporary, a lot of it has become not theological or philosophical, but because it has become studied by people in the classics department, what we call philology, right? And one of the things that happened, especially in France, but other places, is the confessional aspect, whether the Protestants or the Catholics going back to them, has been taken out of the study, so to speak, and has become non-confessional. And one of the things that I think I've hoped to do is maybe reintroduce theology and philosophy into their study of St. Augustine, which I think was important,
As your work as a philosophy professor here at Lasalle, do you talk to your students about Augustine?
Every day.
Every day?
Every day.
And what's their reaction?
It's hard. Well, they're interested. First of all, you have to tell them what his importance is, as we've talked about here. And then we talk about various things that he talked about, various things that he said, various things that he wrote. And when he takes examples out of his life in the Confessions, I found the Confessions one of the best teaching instruments that I've ever had, because the students at age 20 or so can identify with his struggles. Their struggle is his struggle. His struggle is every man's struggle. And so I think that they come to, at least I hope anyhow, they come to really appreciate how great a man and how important Augustine is. But you're right, a lot of them have never heard of him, right?
Sure, yeah.
And but by the end of my courses, they've heard of him.
They've heard of him, I'm sure. Who are you going to tackle next? Are still more?
No, I'm going to stay with Augustine, but you want to do my next project.
Yeah.
I got two projects that I started earlier and I want to finish. But I'll tell you what, Augustine tried twice to comment on the Epistle to the Romans. And the Epistle to the Romans is the most important theological document, I didn't know we were going to get into this, in the New Testament. And Augustine tried twice to comment on it. He realized the work was so enormous that he broke off. Nevertheless, the Epistle to the Romans stands behind most of Augustine. And I'm going to try to pin that down, which chapters and which verses, and how Augustine interprets them. And he interprets them differently than this man and that man and some other man, right? Now, this is a project that I think will take me until I leave this mortal coil, right? But that's what's next.
All right. Well, I want to say what a pleasure it has been to have you here on the program and to talk about your tremendous accomplishment. Continued success. Best of luck to you.
Well, thank you very much, and can I say the pleasure was all mine.
Thank you very much. And until the next time, we'll have to have you come back and talk about that next project that you're going to get involved in.
With pleasure.
All right, very good. I want to thank you all for watching this edition of The Philly Factor. Thanks so much for being with us. My name is Paul Perello. Until the next time, we'll see you here on The Philly Factor.